What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in all of true crime. And if you've been following the long and curvy story of Tupac Shakur, you're in for a treat tonight because we've got some of the best guests. Of course, huge news in the world of music. As you know by now, an arrest has been made in the murder of legendary rapper Tupac Shakur. One of the last living witnesses to the fatal 1996 drive-by shooting of Tupac in Las Vegas was charged just Friday with murder with use of a deadly weapon in the killing of the rapper. It is a long-awaited breakthrough in a case that has frustrated investigators and fascinated the public ever since the hip-hop icon was gunned down 27 years ago. Best guess, you know his face. Retired Las Vegas homicide detective Phil Ramos was present for Tupac Shakur's autopsy, so he knows. We talked about it before this story broke. He saw Tupac. He can confirm that he did, in fact, die, contrary to some of those conspiracy theories that say that he and Biggie Smalls are on an island somewhere off of New Zealand hanging out. But this man, Detective Ramos, saw it with his own eyes. And in his three-plus decade career at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, Detective Ramos also worked undercover narcotics and infiltrated the Cuban mob. He's a three-time Las Vegas Police Officer of the Year and a native Las Vegan. And he was talking to Jeff off camera how it's just starting to cool off. And by cool, he means like 90 degrees instead of 120. So the new face, Kathy Scott, she comes to us from California. She's a Los Angeles Times and New York Times best-selling American true crime author. Not a lot of people can say that. LA Times and New York Times. And an investigative journalist. She wrote the biographies and true crime books, The Killing of Tupac Shakur and The Murder of Biggie Smalls. Both of them were bestsellers in the U.S. and the U.K. And she was the first to report Tupac Shakur's death. So there you go. We're right at ground zero here. Her hip-hop books are based on the drive-by shootings that killed the rappers 6 months apart in the middle of what has been called the West Coast-East Coast War. Each book, coincidentally, is dedicated to the rapper's mother. So that is a nice touch. Jeff Wood, you've seen him before. He's a retired FBI special agent out of Boston. He was focused on gangs and gang violence, and that's why we brought him in, because no one knows that world better than Jeff Wood. Both of Jeff's parents served in Vietnam, where they met and eventually had baby Jeff, who's here today, all grown up, and an Army or military man retired, an FBI man retired. Jeff also, as I said, proudly served in the United States military. Quick programming note. Please support us on Patreon and as a YouTube member. A lot of effort goes into these shows. We're putting on multiple hours a week, and got to pay the bills. So if you can support us on Patreon or YouTube, that would help greatly. If you can't do that, I understand. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. That goes a long way. I hardly mention this, but we are up and running and have been for some time on survivingthesurvivor.com. And all our episodes, video episodes, are posted there. The merch store link is there. Everything is there. So check that out, including where to find me on Instagram at Surviving the Survivor and podcast at Twitter at podcast STS. So quick background, and we'll jump right into it. It's pretty amazing, these statistics that I came up with. But Tupac has actually been dead for longer than the 25 years he lived. He was born in East Harlem back on June 16th, 1971. It is hard to believe, but today he would be 52 years old, gone way too soon. Of course, he was known by his stage name, Tupac. He produced classic rap hits, including California Love, Dear Mama. Snoop Dogg once called him revolutionary and the greatest rapper of all time. And there you see him, different photos of him. He had that magnetic smile. I wish I had those ripped abs. He had those too. It's hard to believe this. His career only lasted 5 years, but he sold over 75 million records worldwide. So think about that. 20 to 25 was his career, 75 million records. His 1996 album, All Eyes on Me, was certified as a diamond album. It includes hits like How Do You Want It and I ain't mad at you. So there you go. So, um, Phil Ramos, you weren't at the scene the night of the murders, but you were at the autopsy a few days later. It was the night of a Mike Tyson fight. What was Vegas like in the 90s on the eve of a Tyson fight? Just kind of set the stage for us before we dive into it.
It was, Vegas was going through a big change, man. It was a carryover from the decadent 80s into the 90s. And, the strip was an adult playground. And people by the millions come there and carry on, have a good time, and sometimes not a good time. And a lot of people leave their mark, sometimes unwittingly. But it was it was a big party all the time. I remember driving up and down the strip in 20 minutes when I was in high school, going to work at the Stardust. And now, man, you can't go a block in an hour. It's so crowded. But even back in the 90s, it was, as the corporations were taking over all the resorts, it was becoming a different town than those of us who grew up here knew. It was, and this particular night was no exception. Tyson fights were a huge draw all the time. They didn't always bring in the most savory characters. There was an aspect to Tyson fights that brought in a criminal element, but that was just the nature of the beast. So that's pretty much what happened that night. A lot of ugly happened from a lot of people behaving in a pretty bad way.
Thank you to Mary Goff for the super sticker. Appreciate that. Kathy, what's the pup's name? We love dogs on STS. We usually have one.
This is Joe. I have Huckleberry Finn here too. He's sleeping. I did have Truman Capote. He died, but she's Joe from Little Women.
All authors, as you figure you would have. That's great. So Kathy, by the way, find me a better panel than these three on Tupac, and I will give you all your money back. I'll tell you that right now. Kathy, the night of this murder, this drive-by shooting back on September 13th, 1996, Tupac was 25 years old. Obviously, one of the most notorious murders in the rap world still to this day. He was in a BMW being driven by Suge Knight, who's now serving time himself. He was in a convoy, I think, of about 10 cars. Where were you that night? What were you doing back then?
I was in bed, and I got a call at about 1:30 or 2 in the morning from a source within the homicide unit who said, "Get up, go down to the strip. There's a big rapper by the name of Tupac Shakur." He couldn't even pronounce his name. Tupac Shakur. And you need to get down there. So I just threw on my clothes, grabbed a notebook and paper, and I went down there. And I've been covering it ever since.
And who were you working for at the time? And tell me, once you got down there, set the scene. What was it like that evening?
Well, I was a reporter. I was a police reporter at the Las Vegas Sun at the time, and but there were a few forensics people, CSI people still there. People meandering around. There was still the car was there still with yellow tape around it. So I basically observed the scene, and all the the major players, most of them were gone, but I didn't, because I must have gotten there maybe 2:30, 3, whatever it was. So most of the major people were gone, and like the homicide guys, and then the next day I hit the ground running. It was a lot of the scene of the crime, the scene where the car was not the scene of the crime, and the two bike cops who happened to be in a parking garage at Flamingo and Koval where the shooting took place. They jumped down, and they heard the shots. It was right there, and they went out to the street. Two bike cops, and Phil, my apologies to the department, but these two cops left the scene of the crime, and followed Tupac down to the strip. My sense is, shouldn't one of them have secured the scene where they heard shots fired, secured that scene, and that would have been a crime scene as well as the second scene where they landed. I was told from Homicide that they didn't get to that Koval and Flamingo scene of the crime for 20 minutes. But that's just, so I just think there are things that happen along the way that might have made things a little easier for the investigation had they not happened.
So Kathy, so the scene was Flamingo and Koval, but are you saying that they rode further away and that's where they stopped?
Suge took off. He's being fired at. So he made a U-turn, Suge Knight, with Tupac in the BMW, made a U-ey, and then went up to the Las Vegas Strip, hung a left until his tires went out because he's, his gridlock. So he's going down the medians. Those two bike cops, Metro bike cops, followed Suge Knight and left the scene where they heard shots fired, left the scene of the crime. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
But maybe bike cop. I mean, they could have called in for backup, gotten people there. One could have stayed and gone later. It's just, I'm not a cop, but I'm just saying, just seems pretty obvious to me. But
Phil Ramos, you were a homicide detective for that department. You want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, it was a pretty dynamic scene. They didn't know what they had really until they were able to make contact with Suge and get the vehicle stopped. So there was a lot of commotion. There was just the two of them. And without knowing more than what they knew at the time, we can second guess it all day long, and everybody loves to do that. But at the point where everything was happening, they only had certain facts to work with. And one of them was, number one, determine if a crime had occurred versus the gunshots that was heard. And once they found out that there was someone fighting for their life, then they took the appropriate action that they needed to take. And as busy as the strip gets, it can take cops a little bit to get there, fighting a lot of traffic, and especially on this night, until they were able to get a grasp on the situation of exactly what happened. They did the best they could under the circumstances that they had.
Shots fired and lots of smoke, and then we can leave it at that.
I would add too, there's a saying in law enforcement, 2 is 1, 1 is none. So if you leave one cop where you kind of hear a shot, now you're leaving another police officer chase something where, there's shots fired, but how do you know who was shooting at who? You see one car, and it's better to have 2 people instead of 1 chasing that car, because yes, it turned out here that Tupac and Suge Knight were the victims, but at the time you don't know if they were shooting back and forth at each other. So it's for safety reasons, you're not going to really want to split up either. So, I mean, I understand your point, Kathy. You make a lot of sense, but at the same time, the calls are going out. The radio calls are going out at that time, but you don't want to split 2 partners up. It's for safety reasons for everyone involved, not just the police, but everyone else involved.
And that's a great point. By the way, you're looking at the man who was arrested, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis. We're going to get into that. I actually had a note to mention this, and I completely forgot. But today is the anniversary, 6 years, believe it or not, of the MGM mass shooting. October 1st, 58 people were killed that night, which is hard to believe. Detective Ramos, where were you the night of the MGM Vegas shooting? And do you like to comment on your thoughts on this pretty somber occasion?
Yeah, it was shocking. I was at home. I had already retired, and I got a call from a friend of mine who was a news anchor at one of the big affiliates, and said, "Have you heard what's going on?" And I said, "No." And he told me what happened. And within a half hour, 45 minutes, I was on the anchor desk with him, doing play-by-play on exactly what was happening, and trying to keep sense out of a situation that made no sense. It was a long, awful night that night.
Yeah, Wow, it's horrific. I don't want to mention names, but I've been in touch with a current Las Vegas police officer who actually breached the door of the shooter that night, a real American hero. Obviously, this is a difficult time of the year, and he's going to come on the show to talk about that night. They call it 1 October. Kathy, were you working in Vegas back then? It was 6 years ago.
I know. I was here already. I'd been here for 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was sad that I have friends. You know, I have a lot of friends in Vegas, so it was a sad day really a sad day for Vegas and America at large. You know, what a horrific thing to happen.
58 people were killed that night.
The
Wow,
biggest ever, right? Isn't
yeah.
that the largest?
I'm almost sure that is still the biggest. Phil, I don't want to get like all macabre and whatever, but how do you even process 58 murders with homicide division? I mean, Vegas is obviously, those are seasoned investigators, but how do you do that? Do you have to bring in other departments?
Well, every single officer that was working that night ended up on the strip. It went to a priority 0 call status, and no calls were being answered anywhere in the valley except there on the strip in relationship to the shooting, unless they were life-threatening emergency calls. I don't think we'll ever see a night like that again here in Vegas, hopefully.
Yeah.
And as far, you're listening to the radio and the body count just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing, and you just shake your head in disbelief, thinking that this can't be happening. There's got to be something wrong. But one officer said the bodies were everywhere.
Yeah, there's still no why. I don't know if we'll ever know why the shooter ended up committing suicide. Stelvieri says Jeff Wood is also a really rad dude. You don't even know the half of it. This guy is you're looking at an American hero. Mary Goff with the super sticker. Thank you very much. Come on, guys. They worked their tushes off. Thank you, Mary Goff. Appreciate that. Jeff, everyone, you were on the show before to talk. Thank you, Carla Riley. You were on the show before to talk about, and thank you, Lenore. You were on the show to talk about MS-13, infamous El Salvador gang. But everyone's heard of the Bloods and the Crips. What was that gang rivalry like in the mid-90s?
Well, in the mid-90s, like all gangs, I mean, their rivalry started back in the late 60s, early 70s, and it's continued to this day. So, they argue over turf. They argue over the drug trade on their turf. Just everything that goes on. Each gang is about trying to make money. And, the Bloods are more loosely associated with the People Nation, which is a collection of gangs that, Florida came up with the term, the People Nation gang would be like the American League, the Folk Nation gang would be the National League in baseball, right? So during the year, they may not all get along, but at times they'll come together to fight their rivals. And so, in the 80s, 90s, even to this day, Bloods and Crips, they war and they're going to take shots at each other. And Suge Knight was a Blood. Obviously, the accused in this case was a Crip, and even though Tupac was not a member of a gang, he associated more with the Bloods than he did with the Crips. He was with Suge Knight that night, and the accused nephew had stolen something from a Blood earlier in the week. They saw him at the MGM Grand. They assaulted him. And then just because that's enough to keep the rivalry going, and that's why they went after Tupac, right?
Yep.
So even though he wasn't a gang member, being associated with a gang member brought him into the crosshairs of the Crips.
Yep.
And that was a fatal flaw. Carla Riley says, I heard that Tupac participated in an assault on Keefe Davis's nephew. We're going to get into that at an elevator in a Las Vegas hotel, and he was the shooter to retaliate for the assault. We're going to get into the details of that. So we mentioned before, this guy Dwayne Davis is the last living witness besides Suge Knight to that fatal drive-by shooting. All the others have been killed, actually, tragically, in gang violence. The grand jury indicted Dwayne Keefe Davis on one count of murder with gang enhancement. Detective Ramos, what does that mean with a gang enhancement in terms of the indictment here, in terms of additional time?
It adds to the penalty of if there's a conviction, it'll add to the penalty, and it'll also add to the bail amount if there's any bail. In this particular case, there is no bail, and I doubt that there ever will be bail permitted on this one. But gang enhancement is similar to enhancement if your victim's over 65 or youthful victims if they're under a certain age. It makes the penalties worse in the event of a conviction.
Yeah.
And there you are. You're looking at some iconic shots of Tupac right there. So, Kathy, I asked you where you were the night of the murder. What were you doing when you got the news Friday that there was an arrest, and what were your initial thoughts?
Well, I expected it because when Vegas police did their search warrant and made it public, and then it went to a secret grand jury, and of course that leaked out that they were, that it was with a grand jury. I knew because of him being in the car and the book evidence, which is hard evidence, and that they would absolutely bring this to fruition. And it was so great to see everybody at the news conference and everything, because somebody said, a couple people called me and texted me or whatever and said, oh, they're never going to do it. They're just, playing it up in Henderson with the search warrant. I said, no way. They would not have made that public unless they had real goods on this guy, and they're going to take him. They're going to take him all the way, and they did. So I wasn't surprised, but it was great news that it finally happened, and there's going to be justice for Tupac and the murder.
And the indictment alleges that Dwayne Keefe Davis was involved in the shooting and obtained a firearm for the purpose, and this is a quote here, seeking retribution against Tupac Shakur and Marion Suge Knight, the head of his record label, Death Row, and a longtime affiliate of a rival set, the Mob Piru. The indictment doesn't say that Dwayne Davis pulled the trigger, but says he and 3 other gang members conspired to kill the rapper by acting in concert throughout. Jeff Wood, to you. So authorities are admitting that he's not the trigger man here, but you've worked on many cases, I think, where gang members have been put away because they're present, but they're not necessarily firing the weapon. Will he be held responsible in the same sort of light and manner because of the fact that he sort of orchestrated this but didn't pull the trigger per se?
Well, that's what conspiracy does. It's a great tool that law enforcement has. So I'm sure Phil has seen it many times in Las Vegas. I've used it many times where I may be the leader and I want someone dead of a rival gang or a suspected informant within my gang, and I order his death. I'm just as culpable of that death, whether or not I actually pull the trigger, as I am the person who goes out and pulls the trigger. So this is a case where, you go back, he had been arrested many years ago and he gave a proffer, and the proffer allowed him to talk and be protected. So they couldn't use his own words against him, where he admitted to these facts. Yes, I helped get the gun. I passed the gun in the back seat. Someone pulled the trigger. But his words could not be used against him at that time. But because he kept talking, you mentioned earlier, he kept talking. He wrote his own book. He kept mentioning it. Now those words, not the words from the proffer,
Right.
Those words can be used against him. And based on that information, they get a search warrant and execute it and get enough information that they can bring him to justice for being, I got the gun. I passed the gun to the shooter. I was present. He didn't even need to be present.
Right.
Just even the gun could have gotten him this conspiracy charge and be held just as accountable. So, that's what makes that charge so great.
It's like mob bosses, the old mob bosses in Las Vegas. The mob boss would call, would call down the order. It would be approved by all the bosses, and then the lower people would go do the dirty deed. So it's very similar to that, isn't it?
It is. federally, and some states have the RICO, the Racketeering Influential Corruption
Mm-hmm.
Organization Act, which does the same thing, but conspiracy also covers that. So you've got the conspiracy charge. So you have lots of different charges to bring everyone responsible for that murder to justice, and that's what they did here.
And by the way, this is the cover of Keefe D's book, Compton Street Legend, and COE. If we can, let's pull up a book cover of Kathy Scott's book. We should have done that. And you see underneath it says Notorious Keefe D street level accounts of Tupac and Biggie murders, death row origins, Suge Knight, Puffy Combs, and crooked cops. Jeff Wood, there's a famous saying, snitches get stitches. And he basically he snitched on himself here. Didn't have to write this book, but do you think he's going to pay the ultimate price of going to prison now, maybe for the rest of his life, Jeff, because of these words that he's put on these pages?
Well, he basically, in this sense, snitched on himself. So, I mean, I don't think anyone's really going to be gunning him. If he had cooperated against other people and put them in jail, and they're still in jail, and he shows up in jail, then yes, he could be a danger. And at that point, I've had a lot of gang members who've cooperated, and I had to put them into the witness protection program there, where they go to witness protection jail to serve their sentence after their cooperation. So, depending on if he has cooperated against others and he shows up to jail, he'd have to be put into a protective custody himself to keep himself from getting harmed.
All those Tupac fans in prison, lots and lots of Tupac fans who are not going to be happy to see Keefe D in their prison. So I would think that he might be a little at risk because of the hard-nosed guys in there who are big-time hip-hop fans.
I will say this. That is very true. But because he's a Crip.
Yeah.
They're very aware of, when they do the intake, they're very aware Bloods are going to identify themselves as Bloods, because everyone in the prison is going to know what gang you're running with when you show up. And they don't want to put Bloods and Crips together, or Latin Kings and Gangster Disciples. They want to keep them separate. So they come in, yep, I'm a Blood, and they'll go to a cell block where there's more Bloods.
So he's going to go in with his homies.
Correct. So he'll be more in a Crip segregation center, and unless he's cooperated against Crips, they're going to protect him, just like Crips protect each other. So
good point.
Yeah. By the way, the other day I was going off on the media, the current state of media, by the way. But if you ever want to see a real reporter, you're looking at one with Kathy Scott. I mean, I can tell she's no nonsense. She's a different, don't take this the wrong way, a different era of reporters that were beat reporters. She knew Detective Ramos right away. She has sources. Us TV guys were kind of like quasi reporters, I would say. But Kathy Scott was mixing it up in the middle of it, and that's why she ended up writing not one but two books. But Detective Ramos, so there was, as Kathy mentioned, a search warrant executed on Dwayne Davis's home, and he doesn't live far from you. He's in Henderson, Nevada, a suburb of Vegas. That's where he was living after this life of crime. What could trigger a search warrant back in July? Was it? I mean, the book has been out, I think, since 2019. And I know it's an active case now, and you're retired, so you have to be a little bit careful. But what would have caused them to go and search his home all of a sudden, all these years later?
Well, there is a years-long backstory on this case. And by years long, I mean, a lot of this information has been known for many, many years. And now that I have the chance, I want to get something cleared up on the record here. There was a detective from Los Angeles who was claiming to be the lead investigator in the Tupac Shakur case. So,
I know his name. Please don't say his name. And I have said that for years. He's a poser. He's a poser. Go ahead.
So let's get that cleared up. This happened in the jurisdiction of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
Exactly. Yeah.
Las Vegas Metro Police was the only lead agency in this case. There were two detectives that were assigned to that, both good friends of mine, Brent Becker and Mike Franks. They were the only lead detectives on this case. So for anyone from a out-of-state agency and in a unit that wasn't even working in homicide, but in the gang unit, to claim that he was the lead investigator is completely inaccurate and very irresponsible to make.
Thank you for
comment.
saying that. Thank you
So,
for saying that, Detective.
And that guy, by the way, whose name will go unmentioned, has been doing the rounds all over media. So I'm glad that, by the way, we are the show of record. Look at this. We've got the real guy, Phil Ramos from the homicide unit. Phil, what about, I mean, you know, are both those guys retired who were on the case? They're both retired. So just what kind of homicide detectives were they? You're good friends with them. I mean, competent guys, I assume.
Very competent, very thorough. They were relentless. I mean, you know, they were a couple of alligators that once they sank their teeth into something, they didn't let go. They both retired, and the case was inherited to my old partner that I trained when he came into homicide, Dan Long, and Dan became the lead investigator on that until he retired. So, like I said, this case goes way back. There's a huge amount of information that'll come forward during the trial, and let me just say that the reason it has come to light right now is there's been some corroboration of the evidence or the stories that Keefe D was telling. That Keefe gave a statement to Dan, my old partner Dan Long, and they didn't just sit on it. They had to corroborate the information that he was giving, because you know, Jeff will tell you, you can't just take a bad guy's word for, well, yeah, I came in here and I shot him and this is what happened. You have to corroborate all of that. You have to make sure that what he's telling you is the truth, because if anybody could walk in and say, yeah, I shot JFK and this is why or how, and this is how it happened. So corroboration is the key to any kind of case where a lot of witness information comes forward, that you have to be able to say, yeah, this is accurate information and we're going to act on it. And let me tell you, it's been years in the making. This is just the surface of the evidence that has come forward, and surely the evidence that they came up with during the search warrant a couple of months ago corroborated a lot of that. But there also could be some new evidence in that search warrant that hasn't been released yet. But if there's a trial, that'll come through. My guess is that Keefe D is going to negotiate his way into a shorter prison sentence, and we'll see how that plays out.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Add to Phil, you know, in today's age, especially with a cold case like this, a district attorney, or if you're talking about a federal type case, U.S. attorneys with the spotlight on this, they're going to want to prove to a judge beyond. You know, I always laugh because all you need is probable cause to get a search warrant affidavit. But there's times they write that with the police where it's beyond a reasonable doubt, because they want to prove to the judge that there is nothing left to chance. So when they execute the search warrant, they're not going to lose anything based on a violation of 4th, 5th, or 6th Amendment. You know, they want to come in there knowing they have it, because especially here, the murder took place in 1996. They don't want to do a search warrant and lose evidence. They want to make sure when they get the indictment, they're going to come in so hot where the defendant's either going to plead guilty and try and get something where he's not looking at life or something, because they don't want to waste their time on such a case where they could lose. They want to win this case. It's a long-standing murder.
And let's keep in
Jeff,
mind,
go ahead.
The affidavit for that search warrant has been sealed, so that information is not going to come out unless there's a trial. And what that means is all the, like Jeff was alluding to, the probable cause has to be established in that affidavit, and those little details that establish your probable cause are what's been sealed. So that's not going to get out to the public until it's time for that to happen, and that will be at a trial.
You know, it's interesting because a few people have asked me, including reporters, how come they haven't released the affidavit, the search warrant. And I said, this isn't Washington, D.C. They don't post it online and all the reporters get it right away. I said, nobody's going to see that because they're keeping everything close to their chest, as they should, because they want to make sure it's a a clean case and nothing gets leaked and it goes, it goes smoothly. So that's so true. But people think that because they see affidavits coming out of political cases that they can see it as well, but they can't. Especially Nevada laws, I think, aren't they, detective, a little tighter than they are in other states, including California?
Yeah, they run pretty much the same across the country. There's little nuances here and there going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but for the most part, they're pretty much the same. If one agency could have a little more control over the release of information, but I also got to remember that the department or the investigative agency is only going to let out the information they want people to know about. They have to have that holdback. They have to have that holdback for the trial.
Yeah.
And you can't reveal everything because people, it's the public's right to know. Yeah, it's the public's right to know, but when it's time for them to know would be the appropriate time, because this all goes back to a fair and impartial trial. Pre-trial publicity can kill your case if you're not careful what you release.
Analytical Blarney AB, Kathy Scott coming in hot with Homies and Poser tonight. I think my evening is made, guys. You never know who you're talking to. If you saw Kathy Scott at Trader Joe's, you probably wouldn't think she knows all about Tupac, but she knows more than you do. I can guarantee you that. Moan Bent here. People don't realize how great an artist he truly was, a writer, poet, musically talented. After all these years, still a legend. Kathy, speak to that. I mean, what kind of talent was he? He's a one name wonder. Tupac. Everyone knows him by that name. I mean, how big was he for the short time that he had this career for?
Well, he was huge. He had catapulted. He hadn't reached his prime, but he was all over. I knew who he was because I was a fan of MTV, but I wasn't a hip hop fan. I don't even think they called it hip hop. At that point they were calling it rap. But he was a poet. And he wrote poetry, outside his low-income housing project, under a street light because the electricity was turned off in his apartment. He was a genius, and he and really self-educated, and his lyrics, I think, just touched people because, the demographic at that time, I don't know what it is right now, but the demographic for his music was white people between 30 and 40 years old. So he touches all people, and I think they could relate to it. At that point, you have to realize too, there was no Vietnam at that point. There was no war. There has been since, but before he died, there was really no social issue for kids to go out and protest or anything. And so they kind of latched on to the rap movement, and it became just very big in all communities across demographics and races.
And I thought the point that Kathy and Jeff brought up is super interesting. I mean, the fact that he's a gang member, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, protects him to some degree. But again, Tupac's a legend, especially inside those prison walls. So will be interesting to see if he gets convicted and goes to prison. And he already served time, by the way. He was in for, I think, 15 years on other charges. So be interesting to see how he is charged. Big shout out to Cynthia Cluck Johnson becoming a member on YouTube. And then we got Mary Binney here, one who killed Tupac, Orlando Anderson, I believe it. So he is the nephew of Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, and his name was Orlando Baby Lane Anderson. This is straight out of a movie, and I'm sure there will be another one after this arrest and possible conviction. But Jeff, what I wanted to ask you about, so basically that night, Suge Knight and Tupac beat up this guy, Orlando Baby Lane Anderson, at the MGM Hotel, and that's what precipitated the shooting. In the world of gangs, what is it like to be just disrespected? I mean, Tupac and Suge were kicking this guy, beating him in the head. That's all it took for them to retaliate and kill.
Well, they were retaliating against against him for disrespecting one of Suge Knight's bloods. So I mean, it's an ongoing thing. You know, if you're a Blood, you're a Crip. I had a source one day who was talking to me about he was a Blood and he wasn't wearing his colors one day, but a Crip came into his territory. He sent 2 Bloods to mess with him and snuck up behind him and had an ice pick and just started shivving the guy, you know, with the ice pick. Just being a rival gang member can cause something to occur. It doesn't. You don't wearing your colors. That same source walking down the street, leaving a Blood party, wearing his Blood colors. Crips drove by, saw him, and shot at him. Right. That's all it takes. Just being a rival gang member. So, yes, the guy stole something from somebody. They saw him. They tuned him up. And now they're mad. Hey, you tuned me up. Fine, I'm coming back after you, and I've got a gun. I'm gonna kill you.
So Jeff, this guy Keefe D, he's 60 years old now. What have you found in your own little research? When these gang members get up there in their 50s and 60s, do they look back and say, "What the hell was I thinking?" Or do a lot of them hold on to like the gang credo and say, "No, this is still who I am"?
It can depend on the gang member. It depends on what's happened in their life. I'm good friends with a former gang member out of St. Louis. We work together in the sense I traveled the country teaching at gang conferences, and their gang conferences would be a law enforcement aspect and a social justice type aspect in the sense of what we can do to prevent and rehabilitate gang members and keeping them from from joining or going back into the gang after they get out of jail. So this kid, well, not a kid now, but he'd been a gang member, and his 1-year-old brother was with him one day. You know, he was at his house with his family, and his 1-year-old brother was in the carriage, and the rival gang drove by, shot at everyone, missed, and killed the 1-year-old brother. And that's when he realized, what am I doing? And so he was one of the teachers, because he would talk about what it took for him to realize, what the hell am I doing? I'm just bringing misery to everyone in my family, in the community I'm living in. And so he went out of his way to try and prevent kids from joining gangs. And he worked with police, and the chief of police and him in his town would work together, where they would bring cops into a room and they wouldn't know they're there. And he would bring these troubled youth who were on the edge. They could go one way or the other. And, you know, when they first get together and sit in the room, they're looking at each other. There's no trust. There's nothing there. But by the end of the night, cops are giving everyone a ride home. They're letting them flip the lights on the cars to play with the cars. And it would start building trust in that community between the police and these troubled youth, and what they could do if they didn't follow down that path. And you know, so again, it depends on the gang member. I've seen it, but I've also seen gang members where they'll continue, and they don't care what it takes. You know, I've had a gang member say, I don't care, using a lot more colorful language than I am right now, but I don't care if my heroin, my fentanyl is hurting people. I'm just about making money. So they want it, great. If they die, I don't care. For me, it's about making money and stuff. So, you know, and typically you don't see a lot of older gang members. They're usually in jail or dead. I mean, some do live longer, but you know, it's a short lifespan. It's a hard game. Thank you, MC Spunky, big friend of the show, and then Catherine Regier, who is in Maui. Thoughts are with you. Look at Catherine giving us a super sticker. She's the one that needs help in Maui. Appreciate that very much. People don't realize right after, kind of in the immediate aftermath of Tupac's assassination, really, there were something like 20 arrests. Just going back in time, Phil, how important was this for Las Vegas PD at the time to try to solve quickly, because you had a massive media spotlight on you?
Yeah, it was. There was a lot of international publicity over this because he was so well known, and we've talked about this before. The inherent problems with gang shootings, which this was, is the lack of cooperation with the cops. The members just don't talk to the police. And look at Tupac's last words to a police officer when the police officer asked him, "Who did this to you? What happened? Who did this to you?" Tupac knew he was dying. And what did he say to the cop? "F you."
Mm.
So that's where you have to start. And that's what the cops had to work with that night. And, Suge, look at Suge. He was right there, bullets zinging past him. He knew who the shooter was. He knew what had happened. He didn't say a word to the cops. The witness that was standing right there watching his friend get shot up and die eventually didn't say a thing to the cops. So,
well, didn't Suge Knight issue the order the next day because there was a bloodbath in Compton, South Central, in retaliation for Tupac's death, the Bloods and the Crips, and one of the guys in the car got dead that day. So did you guys, you work with the gang cops out of Compton on that when there was that bloodbath afterward?
That was
retaliation for Tupac's killing.
That was down the road. We had to work with what we had at the time, and that was very little. So there was a lot of finger pointing. Why didn't Las Vegas do this? Why didn't Las Vegas do that? And at the end of the day, it's what we had to work with that night. And regardless of what Suge said or claims to have said, there still was no cooperation from the people that were there that knew who the shooter was. To the cops, street justice was going to prevail, and that's how they took care of business themselves. But it's a tough gang case. Gang murders are the toughest ones to solve because of that very reason. Nobody wants to talk to the cops.
I want to add to that. Phil's absolutely right. I've walked into emergency rooms to talk to people who've been shot, and it's F you, F off, my gang will take care of this, right, as they're dying. They don't want to talk. And there's lots of different reasons why. And not every department, not every homicide detective is like this, but there has been times where, I've been asked myself, well, Jeff, why do you spend so much time working and trying to solve a gang murder? I mean, it's just a gang member killing another gang member. And it's not that I'm crying my heart out in this case. What I'm saying is a person died. Even if that person is a gang member, even if that person's a criminal, he or she still has a mother, a father, brother, sister, wife, husbands, kids, right? Justice needs to be brought to that person's family over that homicide. And we have to work just as hard, whether it's a gang member who was killed or somebody else who was killed. We have to solve these crimes. And I found in my time working gangs, it's as Phil said, it's very tough because no one wants to cooperate. No one wants to tell you anything. I worked on one murder where you had hundreds of witnesses who saw the murder, and not a single person talked to us because they were afraid of retaliation, for one, and two, they're like, if I open my mouth, the gang will come after me. So it's very tough, and I was very lucky in my career that I had a great group of guys that I worked with, and we never stopped. And whether or not we were a homicide unit, we weren't, but we used the cases we made against gang members to provide to the homicide units to solve those homicides. And that's what it takes, is that policing together and saying, here's something that you can use now to solve this case. And it comes in many different aspects. It's not just the typical homicide guy going out and beating the bushes as he normally would in the gang world. There's a lot of different things that go on to help solve those cases.
Carolyn A says, "Oh, go ahead, Kathy."
The gang cops in Compton, where the shootouts all happened afterward, and Tupac was still alive, and for 6 days, the gang cops told me that one of them was Bobby Ladd. You probably know Bobby. And that Orlando Anderson was running around South Central saying, hey, I capped Tupac. Then when Tupac died, 6 days later, he stopped bragging. And that's when he lawyered up. But he was just running around. Nobody in Compton cared that he was bragging about it. It was like a trophy, and it's sad. You know a lot more about it than I do, Agent. What's your last?
Jeff Wood.
Yeah. But I love titles, by the way. But yeah, so they're bloodbath, and one of the gang cops there, and it doesn't sound like that's your mentality, but one of the Compton gang cops told me, he said, well, it's a twofer. They did this to someone, and somebody else is going to get it for him, and they kill him. Great, it's a 2-for-1. But it's not really. That's not policing, of course. That's just street justice.
Yeah. Carolyn A says Tupac did not succumb to his gunshot wound until 5 or 6 days later. It was 6 days, and you just heard Phil Ramos say that when the police were trying to investigate, he basically told them to go F themselves. Phil, I don't know what you can or cannot tell us, but what was it like being there for the autopsy?
Oh, it was pretty eye-opening. And so let me just touch on that. Yeah, he was alive for 5 or 6 days, but it wasn't like he was ordering breakfast every morning. He was unconscious.
Yeah.
He didn't say a word after that. So
yeah,
there was nothing came out of his mouth after that. He was being kept alive by the amazing personnel at UMC Trauma, and they would have moved mountains to save this man's life, but he wasn't aware and awake and speaking at all, period.
Yeah.
So
he was shot 4 times, by the way.
Yeah. At the autopsy, it was, just the fact of who it was just kind of gave it an extra dimension. I'm standing here looking at the body of a man that's known all around the world, and looking at the wounds that he had suffered. And it was one of those things that you never forget. You always get a handful of cases that follow you through your career, and even while you're sitting in retirement, waiting for that big fish to bite, you think about, oh man, I could have done this differently, or I could have done that differently. But that's one of those images that just doesn't leave your head, seeing Tupac Shakur on an autopsy table.
Yeah. By the way, Michael Couture, I'm sure you're a good guy, trolling everybody tonight. You got 3 experts here that I guarantee you know more than anything you know about this case. Guaranteed. So why don't you chill out and listen to what they have to say?
I've listened to it, so I'll raise my hand. It says how many of these guests have listened to me against the world. But go ahead.
Kathy knows, she's been there. So Michael, take a little chill pill and open your brain up, and you'll probably learn something instead of being so angry at the guys who are telling you the story. They were there. You weren't. Guaranteed. Oh man, just one of those nights. So Kathy, back to you. Take me, I asked Phil, what was it like the first couple of days for you on the reporting side? I mean, you had to know this was, as Phil said, an international story, fans around the world. You're at the epicenter. You're the first to report his death. Guys never heard of this. Some people had never heard of him. You said they called him Tupac Shakur. How long did you stay on the story? How long was it front page news? What were you doing with your sources to try to get the information?
Well, there was a news conference right off the bat, and there was on that first or second day, and all the sports writers were already in town for all the networks and newspapers and whatnot. Magazines were already in town, so the news outlets sent their sports writers to the press conference, and Sergeant Manning headed it. So I attended that, but I went down to the Strip. I interviewed as many people as I could. Of course, I called on my sources. I went into the West Side, talked to people there. Suge Knight had been there earlier in the week, and then I went to Suge Knight's neighborhood, which is walled off, but because Suge Knight had a house in Vegas. And of course the hospital. And then I'd make phone calls several times a day to talk to the hospital staff to find out. They always gave us status reporters. And so I knew he was failing when I was there at the hospital on the sixth day. But it was at the hospital, it was just sad. It was watching people go in and out. And his mother, Fanny Shakur, was, he was in a coma, medicine and medicinally induced coma to keep him still. And in his chest injury, they couldn't close it. They did a surgery, it ripped open again. They did another surgery and it bled, and that's when Fanny Shakur said, "Let him go." And I wish Fanny, she died a year or two ago, and I wish his mother was here to see justice for her son. It was interesting when Biggie Smalls died, and I interviewed his mother, Valletta Wallace. She was all about justice. She sued the LAPD. Fanny was, it doesn't matter if somebody is arrested. It doesn't matter if someone's brought to justice. It won't change it. Her thing was to keep his legacy alive, and she was very spiritual and very much so like her son. He was his mother's son for sure. But it was a somber atmosphere, even in the newsroom. It just was a somber atmosphere. And the hospital was just cars driving around in circles and playing his music and people lined up. They wanted to get news how he was doing, and I was there, of course, when we all learned that he had died. So it was one of his backup singers. I think his name was, oh gosh, it's in my book, but Johnny or something. And I was standing kind of at the curb at that point. It's a short curb. And he came out and just fell to his knees and collapsed and started crying. And it just was sad. They all, I think they understood. They lost a friend. They lost a fellow rapper, and for him, he was, I think his name was Baby or something. But for him, he lost a mentor. But I think they understood too that the world and the rap community lost a very talented person. But his music lives on, and it's probably selling like hotcakes right now.
Yeah, well, let Biggie's mom, if she's still with us, let her know that my wife, the COE, is one of his biggest fans. She would leave me in a second if Biggie was still around, but he's not.
The velvet teddy bear,
Yeah.
Biggie Smalls.
By the way, Michael Couture's back, and sometimes I like to engage with trolls because this is interesting. If I were defending any other murder victim, I'd be an advocate, but somehow being upset at the dishonest portrayal of Tupac's murder as gang-related makes me a troll. Michael, explain to me how it's not gang-related in your next comment, and I'll put that up. I'm curious. Everyone was in a gang. There was a beating that night in gang retaliation, and then they retaliated for that. So if you can explain to me how it's not related to gangs, I'd be very happy to hear. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, again, there's nothing out there that said Tupac was an actual gang member. He associated with both Crips and Bloods, but he had signed with Suge Knight.
That's a good distinction, important distinction. So he was not a gang member. Maybe that's what Michael's upset about, but he was in the crosshairs. But go ahead, Jeff.
But the fact of the matter is, he was an associate of Suge Knight. As a gang investigator, I make him an associate of a gang. Doesn't make him a gang member, but he associates with gang members. And at the time, Suge Knight's a Blood, Keef is a Crip, Keef's nephew, who's a Crip, robs or steals something from Suge's a member of Suge's crew. They retaliate, beat him up, and Tupac participates. when he participates, the gang retaliated. So as a gang investigator, it's a gang-related crime. Whether or not Tupac was a gang member or not, he's a victim of gang violence, which makes this a gang-related homicide. And based on Tupac's association, he acted in a way similar to gang members. You heard Ramos say, F you, when the police asked him, like, who shot you so we can go make an arrest? F you, right? That is a typical gang member type response when police are trying to help them.
There are also, Jeff, photos out there of Tupac throwing West Side, I can't do it, but throwing West Side gang, you probably could, gang signs. So Tupac may not have jumped into the gang, but he certainly acted like he was a West Side blood, because he hung out with the Bloods and his, you know, the guy he was with all the time, Suge Knight, was a big Blood for his entire life. And what if he's not connected to a gang, then what the heck is he doing throwing gang signs? There are photos of him.
Well, and true. And again, when we look at when we look, for me, I can't come out and just say, even if somebody admits they're a gang member, in the law enforcement today, the way we operate, we don't say, you know, and every department has their own type of gang structure of how they identify a gang member. But, you know, self-admitting gets you, let's say you need 15 points to become a known gang member. Self-admitting will get you 10 or 12, right? But they still want a few other things to fully say, I'm a gang member. So they self-admit, that gets them close. But if they have a tattoo, that gets them a couple points. They wear the colors, I'll give them a couple points. They associate, that gets them a couple points. And that will say you're a gang member. That was never done with Tupac. But as you said, Kathy, he's throwing gang signs. Most non-gang members, unless they're good associates, won't throw gang signs because it can get you killed.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm MS-13 and I see someone throwing an 18th Street and he's not 18th Street, but I kill him, it's because he's throwing a rival gang sign. So people who aren't in a gang or aren't associated aren't going to throw signs like that. So, you know.
All great points, and I understand in Michael's head where he is coming from, but I would have to agree that he is incorrect about this. And Stelviri, in case you still feel that way, Michael Couture, Jeff Wood versus Michael Couture arm wrestle. Let's go. I'll have to get Jeff Wood on the arm wrestling circuit. You don't want to mess with Jeff Wood. Trust me, Michael Couture, whoever you are and wherever you are, and I'm sure you're a nice guy, and I'm not meaning to drag you into this, but he did troll me. So to you, Detective Ramos, literally within like days and weeks of this murder back on September 13th, 1996, so many conspiracies were floating around. And one of them was that Tupac and Biggie went off into the, into the sunset, basically holding hands, and moved to New Zealand. Why do you think there were all these conspiracy theories and all this allure? And people have asked you your whole career, did you actually see Tupac? People don't think he was dead. Why all of that sort of mythology around this in all these years that has built up?
You know, conspiracy theorists love that kind of thing, you know, with all the evidence that's right in front of them. I mean, I saw his body. He was dead. And they still think, well, no, that's no explanation. You know, I don't know. Psychiatry is something that is way beyond my expertise, but maybe it's the way people want to deal with the death of a tragic death of someone that they loved. It happens in a lot of high profile, very well publicized deaths and murders. And you know, you're not going to find conspiracy theorists talking about the pregnant 7-Eleven clerk who got shot over a $10 robbery, that they're still alive on an island in the Caribbean. But you know, that's a whole different realm that you just got to take it with a grain of salt, man. It's like no, he really is dead. He really is dead.
And this guy, Phil Ramos, saw him, Michael Couture. Michael X says Tupac predicted his death. He sure did. So a lot of people are asking, you know, why now, 27 years later? This is what Mark DiGiacomo had to say, the chief deputy district attorney in Clark County. He says what was lacking, Phil Ramos, was admissible evidence to establish this chain of events. He said, noting that Mr. Davis then began to describe his role publicly. He admitted within that book that he did acquire the firearm with the intent to go hunt down Mr. Shakur and Mr. Knight, otherwise known as Tupac and Suge. So is it the fact that he wrote in his own words what happened that came back to basically bite him in the behind?
Well, you know, that's certainly something to look at, but you got to read between the lines there. I've known Mark many years. We've been good friends for a long time, and you read in between those lines, and that tells you exactly what the results of that search warrant were, and whatever evidence they came up with to put all these little puzzle pieces together to make one clear picture. The fact that he says what was lacking was admissible evidence to establish this chain of events. Well, that's what was lacking, but obviously it's no longer lacking. So what those little pieces of evidence are, we won't know for a while, but everything that up to this point, up until the point of the search warrant, was being told but not being elaborated on. I'm sure now that's a different situation. The scenario is much more different than it was a year ago, and they're spending all their time putting all these little pieces together to have the good prosecutable case ready to go. And I can tell you, DA Steve Wolfson is chomping at the bit to get to this one. And it's very rare that you see the actual DA participate in a trial. And Steve has said, I'm going to be there. He will be there for the opening arguments, and you don't very often see the actual DA presenting a case to a jury, but it's going to happen here.
And Phil, you know, I'm sorry, you know the judicial system in Clark County better than just about anyone. How soon, if you had to guess, do you think a trial could happen in this case if it does go to trial and there's no plea deal?
Oh, depending on how many games the defense attorney is going to come up with, I would say probably a year away before a trial. Because, see, that's the thing about the grand jury. There's two different ways to get a trial in front of a jury. One is through the grand jury system. The other one is through a preliminary hearing. Grand jury is much quicker, more effective. What a lot of people don't realize is that if you're the target of the grand jury, you are given what's called a Markham notice. And in that Markham notice, you are told by the DA or the prosecuting attorney, look, we're presenting evidence against you in this particular charge, and you have the right to come down and speak on your own behalf. You can also have an attorney, but that attorney is not allowed in the proceedings with you. They have to stay out in the hallway. And if you have a question, you want to answer a question that one of the grand jurors poses to you, you can go outside and speak to your attorney, but your attorney can't come into that room and help you answer the question. So the grand jury system here in Clark County is a really effective way to secure a good, solid indictment and be ready for trial. I would say probably a year.
A year. And look at this, the chief of everything, the wife, the one who does it all. She is chiming in. I do think language and what words you choose can make a big difference. I feel like I'm being yelled at right now in my house. To call someone a gang member versus involved in gang activity versus being in a gang-related shooting are all slightly different. I think that's a good point, COE. And I think that's what everyone on this panel is saying. It's what Jeff Wood said at the beginning. Tupac was not a gang member, but he was acting like a gang member and doing gang-like things and got caught in retaliating against someone, which then resulted in his death. So by default, I would say it was gang-related, even though he's technically was not in a gang, to make that clear. Jeff Wood, the district attorney, this guy Mark DiGiacomo, described Dwayne Keefe Davis, who's now under arrest, as the on-ground, on-site commander who ordered the death. And they listed what they found during the search warrant back in July. And I will read it to you, Jeff, and tell me the relevance, if you would. They found multiple computers, a cell phone, a hard drive, a Vibe magazine that featured Tupac Shakur, several .40 caliber bullets, and 2 quote unquote tubs containing photographs and a copy of Dwayne Keefe Davis's memoir. I assume investigators are going to use all those in laying out their case, right?
Well, only if they're relevant to the actual case. So, they found bullets based on the fact that he's a felon. He can be convicted now at the federal level for being a felon in possession of ammunition. That's illegal, right? So, but what was the weapon that was used to kill Tupac? Can they tie those? If there are some instances that you can try and track based on some things. Do the bullets came from the same box of bullets? That's very hard to prove. I mean, I've seen them try to do that, to say, okay, if a .40 cal was used to kill Tupac, were these bullets from that same box that were never used from 1996? That's going to be very hard. But one of the things that they're looking for, especially with computers and all, is they're going through their hard drives. Did he write something that gave even more details that's not in his book that talks about the murder? He wrote a book, so all the most people now, it's not a typewriter, they're typing on their computer. So what else did he write? What's the drafts? How much details did he provide? Did he write notes to himself to help with his book? So all those things could have extra evidence that they will bring in to the trial. And again, they had probable cause to do that search warrant back in July. It's now the end of September. They went through all that. It's not easy to take several computers, and I've made cases using these things, but you take the computer, you download the hard drive, and then you have to shift through everything through that hard drive to find everything. And it's not easy. It takes a lot of work. So, they wanted more evidence, and I imagine they got it from everything they found, and they're going to use what they found, which is relevant in the trial.
Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, Detective Ramos. Guess who was communicating with Keefe D for the last few years, helping him with his book and going on with all kinds of weird conspiracy issues? The unnamed out of LAPD. He was in constant, and he called me. He calls me periodically, not very often, but I heard from lots of people that they were writing a book together. So I'm envious because you guys get to read that stuff. So when the trial, when everything happens, but he because he was a conspiracy theorist, and he may have helped him tool that. So all that's going to be in the trial and in the evidence, I would think. Just an interesting side point for you.
Yeah. Kathy, I wanted to come to you on this. This came up Friday when the news first broke on our show. William M. says, STS panel, do you guys believe they are coming for Diddy next? There was talk that P. Diddy actually was the one that orchestrated a lot of this, and that he could be involved. What do you think of that?
No, absolutely not. That's part of the East Coast, West Coast, which that happened. East Coast, West Coast rap war happened at a studio in a quad studio in New York in Manhattan when Tupac showed up to perform, and Biggie was there with Sean Combs, his producer, and Tupac was there with his homies, and Tupac walks in and he got shot, and the police only investigated it about a week. It was a random shooting because Tupac and his and his guys were walking up to Quad Studios to go. He was going to do backup for a singer, and they're just loaded with gold necklaces. So they walk in bracelets and everything else, and they walk into Quad Studios and they just yanked the jewelry off of him. And Tupac reached into his waistband. He had a gun, and he shot himself. And Tupac, shot himself in the groin area. And Tupac was doing court the next day. It wasn't that bad, and he appeared, but he was in a wheelchair. So that is Genesis. So after that, Tupac went to jail, and in jail at Rikers, someone told him, hey, it was Biggie. Biggie was behind that shooting. And thus began the East Coast, West Coast rap war. And that is all it is. And it was in really a figment of Tupac's imagination, and he believed it. But it ruined their friendship, because Tupac and Biggie were friends. He used to bring Biggie on the stage all the time because Tupac was bigger than Biggie at that point. So it has nothing to do with the shooting in Las Vegas. And P. Diddy is a businessman. He runs an incredible, hip hop. Music production company, and has a college degree, and has never been affiliated with gangs. So that's just old rumors, and people who try to solve something and try to figure it out in their own heads. There's no evidence pointing to any of that.
And someone was asking if we're going to cover this when it goes to trial, if it goes to trial, if there's no plea deal, and we will be on it, and we'll have this very panel back. Kathy, back to you on this. Ramon Bent, a friend of the show here. Do you all think Suge has given more information recently to fill in the gaps? Do you think authorities, Vegas homicide detectives, traveled to visit Suge in prison?
Suge is an interesting specimen, because he went out publicly and said, "Oh, it was the Crips who did it. It was, not, and then he would name Sean Combs, Biggie Smalls' record producer, as doing it. And he came out with all kinds of weird stuff later. And of course, we all know that he ran over a movie producer. Not once, but twice. He backed up and ran over him again and killed him, because he wouldn't put him in his movie Straight Outta Compton. So he's kind of a loose cannon. You can't believe anything he says. So I'd be surprised. Maybe there is something, but he never helped. I mean, Detective Ramos, what did they do? They brought him in eventually. Finally, I think it was a month or two later, they brought him into the homicide unit. And I think Suge wanted to talk about the weather, so he wasn't happy. He wasn't helpful to them that day at all. So no. That boy has not turned over a new leaf. He just, Suge Knight just hasn't, and he's a little wonkers right now. So little wonky. So I don't think he's going to be any help. I'd be surprised if they bring him in.
Michael has Puff set Pac up for sure. Go ahead, Phil.
In fact, recently we talked about this not too long ago, when all this started happening, when the search warrant was issued and all that. Someone interviewed Suge and flat out asked him, said, "Suge, are you saying that even with this new evidence that's coming forward," I don't know what evidence they were talking about, "you're still not going to say anything to the cops?" And he said, "Hell no, I ain't saying anything to the cops."
Yeah.
So that'll never happen. Suge will never say anything.
But he's not believable. He isn't believable,
Yeah.
Right.
Jeff, I wanted to come to you on this. So in his memoir, and I'll put it back up here, Compton Street Legend, we're looking at the cover right here. And COE, if you can get the cover of Kathy Scott's book on Tupac, that'd be awesome. Here's Compton Street Legend by Keefe.
You don't want to be selling Keefe D's book.
Yeah.
You're selling his book right now.
Yeah, I know. But look at this line here real quick. to you, Jeff Wood. Dwayne Davis described the, quote, strict code of the streets that its participants, quote unquote, live, kill, and die by. And he says Tupac's and Biggie's deaths were direct results of that code violation and the explosive consequences when the powerful world of the streets, entertainment, and crooked ass law enforcement collide, he wrote. Break that down for us a little bit. I mean, he, in his own words, is saying that this was all gang related, even though Michael Couture is telling us it is not. You're hearing from the Compton Street legend saying that it is, right?
I can comment later too.
Okay. Jeff?
He's writing his memoir saying, look, he's a gang leader. He's a gang member, right? He proffered to this years ago to get a reduced sentence in a case he was charged with. He spoke. It just, as the district attorney said, we have no evidence we can use in court right now. So this book is kind of what started reopening the case for the homicide units to go to work, because he's now admitting to these things. And it's one of those, and again, it comes back to what Phil said earlier, right? Just because he said it doesn't mean we can use it right away to get everything. We want to make sure we corroborate what he says. So, I've always looked at it and said, okay, what he's saying is truthful here, and then what someone else is saying is truthful here, and then the real truth is kind of in the middle, right? So, I mean, I think he gave a lot of good information there, but the police had to do their due diligence and go out and do their work and corroborate what he said, so that they would have enough probable cause to convince a judge to give them what they needed for a search warrant. And then based on that, based on the evidence they got from the search warrant, they were able to present evidence to that grand jury. It's what, in the federal system, we do it all the time. And when you're taking it out of a district court to get to superior court, ended up higher in different states, you have to go in front of a grand jury and you have to say, here's my probable cause to the grand jury, and say, this is why, this is all the evidence I've gathered to say that this person's guilty of this crime. And at the end of the day, when they presented that evidence, the DA will come back and say, grand jury, do you believe what we've presented to you is enough to indict the person for this crime? And they take a vote, yes or no. They return the vote of, we think he's guilty based on the evidence. Now, that's just probable cause. Now the DA is going to go to the trial and present a jury with the evidence again and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty of this crime. But as I said earlier, at this point in the game, from 1996, the DA does not want to get egg on his or her face. It's a guy, obviously, so his face. But no DA out there, whether it's a man or a woman, at this point wants egg on their face on such a high-profile case. They're going to have their ducks lined up in a row to say, we're going to be able to prove this in trial, because they want to bring this case, close it out, bring justice to the family and everything. So, yes, they're using his words from his book and his interviews. They just couldn't use anything he said back in his proffer.
Yeah. Melanie says anyone that's been following this since 96 knows that P. Diddy definitely is involved in it. Hopefully they pull his bank records, followed by this. We're talking about the $1 million Keefe said Puffy offered to pay him. What is she talking about? Meaning Kathy Scott. Kathy, you want to respond to that and whatever else you wanted to say?
That came from the unnamed detective. That $1 million offer and all of that, and he was working with Keefe D at that time. So I'm not going to give him the credence of listing his name, but he's the one who put that out there, and he put it in a book. And I don't know if that's in there too. That they're that big, and it also came from the LA Times, and that reporter got fired for the story saying that Biggie Smalls was in Las Vegas at the time of Tupac's death, and the $1 million was exchanged there, and Diddy got it. That reporter got fired. you don't see, when you see corrections, you never see a retraction, even though people like to call them retractions. They're not. They're corrections. They retracted the story. They took it off of the website and they apologized for it. And that put that ridiculous statement out there. As for Suge Knight, I would imagine in prison he's still a blood. If you read the lawsuit with Valletta Wallace, because she sued the LAPD for not solving her son's murder, if you get into the weeds on that case, I don't know if you guys have read those, all of it. I've read everything. They came to the conclusion and didn't put it any further, but they came to the conclusion that that a former LAPD officer went and hired, paid a guy by the name of Muhammad. It's all out there, to go kill Biggie Smalls. And guess who gave that order from prison? It was, and they've got him going in and visiting Suge Knight. And that's been out there. I'm not releasing anything that nobody doesn't know. But Suge Knight was the one who put out the hit on Biggie Smalls. But the LAPD have opted not to push that case forward. But it's food for thought. But it's out there. Anybody can search and find everything I just said. But so that's why, because I wasn't going to talk about it, but that's why Suge in prison right now, it's almost a joke, to anybody take credence on anything that guy says. So I'm just saying, putting it out there. And you've probably heard that, haven't you, Detective Ramos?
Yeah, a little bit. That's something that's just come up recently as far as the investigation goes. I'm sure all kinds of stuff has been out there in the years prior, but
it's in the affidavits.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's putting any stock in that.
Exactly. Yeah.
By the way, there's Kathy Scott's book, The Killing of Tupac Shakur. You see him there in that Beamer, the revised and expanded version. Are sales picking up right now, Kathy, with this news?
The publisher checked. He contacted me, and yeah, their sales are hopping like crazy. And he's probably going to come out with a third edition. I'm not about sales; it's not who I am. But I'm always happy to have them. But he may be doing another. It would be the fourth edition, fourth and final, which would be nice to do. I got to do it with the Susan Berman and Robert Durst book, and got to do a final edition when Robert Durst was convicted of her murder. So it's the same thing now. Put it to bed, and I don't have to write about it again.
Wow, these are big cases. Caroline Miller says, "Good for Kathy." Jeff Wood, to you, and then we'll wrap up in just a couple minutes. This guy Dwayne Keefe Davis did an interview with a guy named DJ Vlad, who chronicles rap life, and in speaking to him, he was by the way Dwayne Davis's nephew, who they had gotten into that fight at the MGM that fateful night. He died 2 years later in a gang-related shooting. But in speaking to DJ Vlad, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis said that, and this is a direct quote, Jeff Wood, "They want to put me in jail for life." Speaking about this crime, he said, "That's just something I got to do." Is that the general mindset of a gangbanger?
I've always said we or people, when I get asked a lot of questions about criminals, is people who aren't criminals don't think like criminals, and it's a totally different mentality. So criminals have a totally different mentality than we do, and what seems completely out of the blue or something that's unbelievable is believable to a gang member. So yeah, I mean that would be a typical gangbanger type response to different things. But again, it comes down to when it comes to a gang member, what you and I would think is normal is not normal to them, and what we think would be abnormal is normal, right? So you just getting into delving into the gang world, it takes a lot of rethinking your mind, right? One thing I always laugh about is, and it's not that I laugh, it's just people say, Jeff, you're a gang expert. And I disagree with that statement of a gang expert. The only experts in gangs are gang members themselves. I'm an expert in identifying, infiltrating, disrupting, and dismantling violent street gangs that have a negative impact in our communities. So in that sense, yes, I can. If you want to incorporate that as your gang expert, yes, then I meet your definitions. But a friend of mine, he teaches us a lot too, and he says the same thing. No cop out there is a gang expert, because we're not gang members. They're the experts on their lives. And if you listen to gang members, they'll tell you that too. But the expertise comes in is removing them from our communities to keep those communities safe. So yes, I would agree that that's a typical type of gang members' response to a question.
Little Monster, can't wait to read it. Kathy Scotch is going to buy and read Kathy's book. Final comment and then closing remarks to you, Detective Ramos. So the DA, Steve Wolfson, in the press conference says it has often been said that justice delayed is justice denied. But in this case, justice has been delayed, but justice won't be denied. I'm curious, I know you're talking to your friends, your old homicide friends. Is there a sense today of, being triumphant, even though the trial hasn't happened or a plea deal hasn't happened, but that, it's finally like, we got you after all these years?
No, not really, because while it's nice to have one of the co-conspirators charged with this, you didn't get the actual shooter. And that's what everybody wants to be able to say is, the person responsible for your loved one's death is in prison. But in this case, strictly my view, true justice won't be served because the man who actually killed Tupac is dead himself. I guess in a way that's justice in one's view, but the co-conspirator that was involved is going to face justice, but it's not like you got the shooter.
Interesting take. That doesn't surprise me coming from Phil Ramos, who's a consummate homicide detective who wanted to get the trigger man, but this is the best they can do. I mean, everyone else is dead except for Suge Knight, who's in prison. A man who's not in prison but put a lot of people there is Jeff Wood, retired FBI special agent out of Boston. You just heard him say he doesn't like to be called a gang expert, but he is. He knows more about it than most people, and definitely more than Michael Couture, whoever he is. Both of Jeff Wood's parents served in Vietnam, where they met, and they had little baby Jeff, who grew up to be a big, bad, good, bad guy, serving the United States military. Jeff, is this gang violence ever going to end? Is there anything that can be done? Can we educate young kids? Is it just part of the culture in the streets? Is there anything that's ever going to change this?
I don't think we'll ever change it, because if you go back, pirates were gang members on the seas, right? We had gangs for as far back as we can remember.
By the way, Ned Smith says Jeff is a hunk too, on top of everything else. But go on, Jeff.
Thanks, Ned. But in my mind, when you have both good policing, where you go after the gang members who are committing the violence and you remove them, you see a reduction in gang violence. I was on your show several months ago, and we talked one of my biggest cases that we did, or one of my most memorable cases. I just remember, here's some statistics for what we talk about. In 2010, I took out the Bloods, the Crips, some gangster disciples, Latin Kings, the neighborhood gang, and their drug dealers in a city. And 6 months prior to that takedown, we had 63 gangs in that town, in that city. For a full year after that, you only had 2. So it's that work, and then working with, because right after we did the takedown, we worked with social justice type entities to try and do work in preventing from kids joining gangs, and kids who are coming out of jail from the county or state prisons from going back to the gang life. And that's what helps lower violent crime for a while. But you can't let up. You can't just rest on your laurels after you do a case. You have to keep targeting gangs as they're coming back up so you can keep that level of violence down. So will it ever go away? I don't think so. Not until we get back on track on trying to remove those violent criminals from the streets.
Well put. The chief of everything chiming in. Hey, SDS Nation, if you haven't, please consider joining our YouTube membership or Patreon, especially you, Michael Couture. I know you love us and you love our show. We put out 10 plus hours of content a week and sometimes much more for free. We need your support to keep going. Yes, we do. Please do that. Michael Couture, if you're going to troll Space Coast, who's my brother-in-law and a dear friend and a musical genius, by the way, spell leeching right. It's 2 E's in this sense, not L-E-A's. So if you're going to do that, at least spell it correctly. Thank you. Kathy Scott, she's a Los Angeles Times best-selling author. She's super cool. I think she might be one of my new favorite guests here. No offense to Phil Ramos, but Kathy Scott is a Los Angeles Times and New York Times best-selling American true crime author, and some people had the chutzpah, that's Spanish for cojones, to say that these people don't know what they're talking about. New York Times and LA Times best-selling author and an investigative journalist who penned the biographies and true crime books, The Killing of Tupac Shakur that you're looking at, and also The Murder of Biggie Smalls, arguably the 2 biggest rap artists of all time. And the books were bestsellers in the U.S. and the United Kingdom. You heard her say it's not about the sales, but sales are up because this is an important story. And she dedicated each book like a real good woman to the mothers of these rappers. And I don't know if Biggie's mother is still with us, but you mentioned Tupac's mother is no longer with us. Kathy, your final thoughts. Do you think this goes to trial? Is Dwayne Keefe Davis going to finally get convicted for this crime?
Oh, I think he's going to get convicted, whether it goes to trial or whether he pleads out, as Detective Ramos said might happen. I think good on the Metro Police Department. They, despite the number of years, it doesn't matter. They're bringing him to justice now, and justice is being served. So I think it's kudos to them, and I think it's a real feather in their cap that they've, after all these years, and it's hard to go out there and get, witnesses for a crime that's 27 years old. And so they've obviously been working their tails off and landing documents and interviews and everything else, and that goes into it. And so my congratulations to the Metropolitan Police Department in Las Vegas for bringing this, and hopefully they will prevail, and I believe they will.
Well
There's a new sheriff in town. That's what I like to say, and because he was elected last year. Because somebody said, "What changed?" I said, "There's a new sheriff in town," and good on them for looking on it, and kudos, because I applaud them for it.
Excellent. STS, the chief of everything, back. We're also looking for sponsors of any size. If you know someone who wants to sponsor STS, please put us in touch. survivingthesurvivor@gmail. Sponsors of all size works. Joel hates to ask, but it must be done. Thank you. Yes, I do. I do hate to ask, but there you go. And then you've got Dom's mom. Thanks for putting up with us, Joel and panel. It's been a hot one. Great show, though, as always. Couple of these coming in. Ramos is a fox. Oh, this was the wrong one, though. Respect to the panel. And yes, Jeff is a honk. I second that. But Spitfire says that Ramos is a honk. And I start another one, I think, somewhere that is of a similar. Look at this. This is the one. Little bit. I like my Scott Duffy, another FBI agent, but kind of crushing on Ramos. Who doesn't? He is a retired Las Vegas homicide detective. He is Phil Ramos. He was present at Tupac Shakur's autopsy, along with Michael Couture, our favorite troll of the day. In his 3+, was Michael Couture at the autopsy, Phil Ramos? Sorry, I had to ask. In his 3+ decade career, Detective Ramos has also worked undercover narcotics and infiltrated the Cuban mob. He's a 3-time Las Vegas police officer of the year and a native Las Vegan. Do you think this goes to trial, Phil, or will there be a plea deal? And how does this all turn out in the next year and change?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a plea deal because it would behoove him to plead out, because you never know what a jury's going to do. You may get the max. Plea deal, you won't get the max. So I predict a plea deal.
There you go. You heard it here first. We will get this esteemed panel back on for sure. Quick programming note. Tomorrow night, Rachel Morin, she's a mom of 5. She was murdered on a Maryland hiking trail back on August 5th. And by the way, Collier Landry, who we met at CrimeCon, great guy. Survivor Squad is his show. Don't mess with the STS chief, everything. I've seen her in action. Yes, he has. By the way, Collier Landry has some big guns as he's flexing the gun emoji there. And I mean biceps, not actual guns. But check out Collier's YouTube channel. And his dad infamously murdered his mother in what is become known as a murder in Mansfield, Ohio. And Collier took the stand at, I think he was either 11 or 12 years old. And he now has a podcast with Tara Newell. And together, that is the Dirty John, Tara Newell. They have a show called Survivor Squad. So please check it out. Great podcast. And they are doing phenomenal work. And as I said, I got to meet him and Tara at CrimeCon. But quick programming note. Rachel Morin, she's a mother of 5. She was murdered on a hiking trail in Maryland back on August 5th. Police have put out basically a bolo. Be on the lookout. They have a suspect who they basically caught through DNA, through CODIS, but they don't have an ID on that suspect. Thank you to Pam for the super sticker. So the killer is still at large, and they fear that he could strike again, could even potentially be a serial killer. And tomorrow night, we've got Rachel Morin's family attorney, a guy named Randolph Rice, and he's coming on with Rachel Morin's sister-in-law. And so she will be here along with Scott Duffy, who is from that kind of from that area. So he's going to fill in the gaps from the investigative side. It's going to be a very interesting show. And then Tuesday, 1,000 kids missing in Ohio. What is that all about? Is that clerical mistakes on the part of law enforcement, or is there something really sinister going on with child trafficking, which some are suggesting? We're going to look at that Tuesday night, and then we're going to figure out the rest of the week from there. So until then, love you, America. Love you, Las Vegas. Love you, Boston and Alabama and California. Until next time. And panel, hang on for 1 sec.